Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters and dear friends. On my left we have Jacob, handsome man, charismatic. His defense is impregnable. On my right we have a boy. Yes. I'm joking. So we have Mohammed Hijab and brother Jacob. Jacob, I've spoken to him a couple of weeks ago about contingency, and he just wants to ask me some questions. So I'm going to leave it for you guys, inshallah. Hijab, make sure you get him as well with the mic.
Of course,
not
of
too
course.
Close, not too close. Yeah,
no, I'll give it to him.
Yeah, but keep it away.
It's too loud. Yeah. All right.
So you guys can.
So no, I'll start with you. So can you introduce yourself? Tell me who you are, what you support, what your background is, and why you wanted to talk to me.
Sure. So shall I hold it? Yeah. You trust me with that? Is this good? Okay. Right. All right. So hello all. My name's Jacob. I've been wanting to meet Hijab for some time because I confess a little bit of a fanboy in that I disagree with pretty much everything he says, but in terms of a sort of intellectual debating type fella, he's a bit of a hero of mine, especially after watching. To be honest, I don't think Cosmic Skeptic held his own in that Oxford debate with you, to be honest with you. But yeah, no. So I'm a sort of general non-believer, libertarian, nationalist type, and I just thought I'd come and have a little chat. Yeah, Tommy supporter as well, but against anyone who's in support of violence. But I think I find that I reconcile that with Tommy very easily. I don't think he's a violent person. I think he made some mistakes in his past, but I think he's a very good man. I think he's fighting for England. I've got a lot of respect for him, as I do for a lot of Muslims. So
I think it's the first time I met someone who's described me as a hero and Tommy Robinson as a hero in the same breath.
Very possible, in very different ways.
Whoa. All right. So you said you read my book
a while ago, I admit. So,
right. So what kind of we'll talk about Cosmological Arguments.
Yeah.
Where I make the kind of what's referred to as the argument of contingency.
Yeah, Leibniz.
Yeah. Well, Leibniz is he's a main proponent nowadays.
The Arabs did it first.
Yeah. Well, Aristotle had his own version, right? The Greeks had their own version.
Yes.
The Arabs, and then the Enlightenment. Yeah. All right. So what were your thoughts on the argument? Can you summarize what you understand from the argument first?
So as I understand it, thank you. It's basically Aquinas' third way, isn't it? I think it's his third way. He says I think and then Leibniz sort of adapted it from him. He says there are contingent things or possible existences in this world, and obviously everything needs to have some sort of cause, otherwise it wouldn't be contingent, and this must be basically a chain of causality terminating in a necessary being, and we, the Christian or the Muslim, calls that being God. Correct me there if that's...
Yeah, so you're right to some extent. There's two ways of doing contingency, right? One of them is through causality and the other one is through explanation. That's traditionally. So in other words, the contingency argument, or what I think it is a kalam cosmological argument as well. That's my
I disagreed with that, but
yeah, there's a difference of opinion on that. Either way, it can either be done through causality or it can be done through explanation. It doesn't need causation, right? But yeah, you could go through that route and say, okay, well, if you believe in cause and effect, a priori, as well as cosmologically, like in other words, things in the cosmological environment which are affected by something have a cause. A phenomena which has something that brought rise to it, which is the textbook definition of a cause, basically has a cause. That phenomena has a cause. If you believe in that a priori, or if you believe in that even from a cosmological perspective, you could argue that, well, then they have to have a first cause or whatever, right? But that's not the only way of doing contingency. So you can do it through dependence as well. Dependence and So what do you think about that argument?
About the dependency one, So I separate that, by the way, from the kalam. The kalam I hold to be the sort of traditional one that Craig popularised, the sort of whatever begins to exist has a cause, universe began to exist, therefore God, basically. And then the contingency one, I think it's stronger, to be honest with you. I mean, the kalam really is on shaky ground on both its premises, but the contingency one is much more impressive because at face value it does seem as if, okay, an infinite regression seems incompatible with everything that we understand about the world. And so it seems very reasonable to say, yes, this must terminate somewhere in necessity, I think it's a bit of a leap that they then call that God. So people like David Hume said, no, why can't it be? I think it was using the persona of Cleanthes. He said like, oh no, he says first to his debater. He says first of all, you're assuming that there is some necessary being, and he doubts whether you can even use the term necessary as having any coherent meaning. And then he says, okay, suppose that there is. He says, why can't this just be the totality of the universe? And then, so for me, there's several issues with it. It's just, for one, if there is something necessary, okay, it could just be the totality of all that exists. I realise there's problems with that, and there's plenty of counter-arguments you can make. One could simply be that there are just contingent things, okay, and it doesn't seem like sort of logical, 100% that there must be something necessary, as it were. I'd say those are the two main. The other problem is, from an objectivist point of view, right? We might say, necessary is anything that you couldn't conceive, you couldn't conceive otherwise. Like some people say, no, the planet Jupiter is actually necessary, and you might say, oh well, you can conceive of planet Jupiter not being there, but can you really? Is it possible to? I'm not sure if you can conceive of a universe in which there are things that are not there, which leads me to believe maybe there are more than one necessary existences. So that's about 3 arguments in one. I don't know if I've...
So all right. So the first thing you mentioned was that the William Lane Craig type cosmological argument. He wrote a book in '79 called Kalam Cosmological Argument.
Yeah.
My book is called Kalam Cosmological Arguments.
Yeah.
So with that, the reason why I called it that is to show that this is not one argument.
Right. Yes,
right.
Yes.
So the one
you
that
made Avicenna's argument,
yeah.
Al-Ghazali's, and
Al-Ghazali, the one that William Lane Craig focuses on is the Ghazalian one. But even Al-Ghazali, in his most famous book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, which is the incoherence of the philosophers, very good. Even he postulates more than one argument, which is. So he makes an argument from movement, which is quite similar to you were talking about Aquinas.
That's
so,
Thomas.
but he says that, for example, this is one of his other, because you talked about one of his arguments, he mentioned this in one of his books. He says everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, or the alam. By the way, the universe is not a good translation of what Ghazali actually said.
Oh, what's the translation?
He says the world began to exist, not the universe. The universe is a new term, right? So he says al-alam, or the world began to exist, therefore the world has a cause, right?
Yes.
So William Lane Craig latched onto this. He makes all his. If you see William Lane Craig argue, that's his argument. Ghazali made that argument and more than that argument. So for example, he said, look, one of his arguments that he made, which is also a cosmological argument, because a cosmological argument is an argument that makes reference to the cosmos, literally to the world around us. He said, look, that movement is really, what is it? It's time and movement.
Time and space.
Yeah, time and space. He says, look, he says that if you believe in movement, he made an argument for movement, the first mover argument, which is the same argument as Aristotle. He said, if you believe in time, you believe in movement. So long as there is time, there is movement, and if there is movement, there must be a mover. That's another argument, right? So the argument of movement. Aristotle made that argument. Ghazali made that argument. Avicenna didn't reject the argument, but Avicenna said about that in his book. He said, look, he said and this is a good point. Avicenna said, just because there's a first mover, it doesn't necessitate that first mover is the cause of everything that exists.
Yes.
So you can believe in a deistic first mover. You can believe in the Albert Einstein God. Anyway, the first mover argument may give us evidence that there was in fact a first mover, or an eternal mover. However, it doesn't give us evidence that that mover has intelligence, or that mover is the cause of everything that exists.
It's a big jump from deism to theism.
Absolutely, yeah. No, all of the argument. Look, I'll be frank with you. The maximum we can prove from a logical perspective is deistic.
Oh, brilliant! Oh, you accept that?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Because if you define theism as a personal God, then there's no real first principles you can use to establish that. Here's what we say. We say as Muslims is that our fundamental, foundational definition of God doesn't depend necessarily on a personal God. That's additional information that we
can. That's a more Christian concept as well, I think.
Yeah, no, that's additional information that we only come to know ipso facto through revelation. So look, the necessary cause is this. Everything in the world is dependent. Whether like this book is dependent on the materials, whatever, and it goes back, and you can't have that process not going back to something which is necessary. In other words, something which does not depend on anything else. As simple as that. So you have to have an independent to have all other dependent things. If you want to simplify the argument to the lowest common multiple, you have to have an independent to have all other dependent things. What are the attributes of that independent? That independent must be eternal, because it couldn't be conceived of any other way at any other time, so it has to be like that forever. In the past, pre-eternal and post-eternal. It has to be necessary in the fact that it can't be conceived of any other way, and it has to be the reason for everything else that exists, the ultimate reason. So your objection that you mentioned about the universe, it being the universe, is not actually an objection, because all you're doing is you're saying that I believe in a necessary existence can exist, but that necessary existence could be the universe. So someone could say, okay, well, so you agree with the premise of the argument, but you just agree with the nature of the necessary existence. So really, the postulation, which is what Bertrand Russell kind of alluded to himself, and others as well, that the universe is the necessary existence.
Yeah, I think it comes from Hume.
Yeah, of course, because he came before. But the point is that if you say that, it's not a rejection of the argument then.
I see what you're saying.
You see the point? So you accept the argument, but you just have a different understanding of what could be, right? God.
Yes.
Sorry, I wouldn't use the word God. The necessary existence. The necessary existence. So at this point, that's not a rejection. It's not an objection to the argument, or a rejection of the argument.
Yeah.
You agree with the argument, but you say, okay, it could be the universe. So no problem. For now, we won't rule the universe out. But for now, we'll explain why it won't be the universe in a second, right? But for now, let's agree that first of all, you accept that there must be a necessary existence.